Hey everybody, geeks and geekettes, and all you folks out there in comic book land. It's Wednesday morning. It's time for another edition of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, Chuck Dixon, questions about what I do for a living, and what I do for a living is I write comic books. Let's get to the first question. Michael Hutchinson, good old Hutch, says, as someone who worked under the Comics Code Authority, what was your opinion of it? Do you think that the tone of comic books has been affected by its removal, even though there are rating systems on the books, etc.? Well, for those of you who don't know about the Comics Code, let me take this opportunity to provide you with a little history. Back in the 40s and 50s, comic books were not under any kind of supervision from the outside. There was no censorship as there was for radio, television, and movies. Comics kind of relied on what they could get away with. So, post-World War II, they began to push the envelope a bit, particularly on violence, quite a bit on sex, and try to, I think that in a way they were trying to read their readership, read their audience, and trying to keep that vast number of GIs who read comic books while serving in World War II, try to keep that readership. Movies and other areas of entertainment kind of grew up a little after World War II because, 5 million men in uniform, and many of them had seen stuff. They left the farm and they saw stuff they wouldn't normally have seen. They grew up quite a bit. Saw some horrible stuff. Saw some wonderful stuff. But they were exposed to a greater range of human experience than the generation prior. And so they were a little more jaded when it came to entertainment and life in general. And who can blame them? And so comics tried to appeal to that feeling. And a lot of the comic book creators were vets themselves. So a lot of this new material with more violence, more sex, grew out of their own experiences. And to be fair, paperback books were exploding, and they were pretty lurid. And they were pushing the envelope on sex and violence hard. They were marketing sex and violence. And the movies were doing it to the degree that they could, given that there was a censorship office in Hollywood. But all of that party kind of came to the end when Frederick Wortham, a psychiatrist, showed up, and he wrote a little book called Seduction of the Innocent. And everybody after World War II was like really torqued up about juvenile delinquency, the rising crime amongst our youth. Given the fact that in most American cities you could walk the streets safely at 4 a.m., they would definitely see our world as post-apocalyptic when it comes to urban crime and juvenile delinquency. A couple of kids getting in fights and shoplifting and maybe a stabbing here and there. Threw the whole country into this panic. So everybody was willing to listen to anybody who could explain why this was happening and how we could stop it. And Frederick Wortham pretty much blamed it all on comic books. Ignoring puberty and hormones entirely. It's all comic books' fault. And as usual, when a public furor arises and the public gets interested in something and it hits the media, the politicians sweep in and get their little piece of the pie. So there were Senate hearings about comic books, and they were televised. And it didn't go well, particularly for the creators at EC Comics, who, quite frankly, in my opinion, I love the old EC Comics, but in my opinion, they were pushing it a little too far. They were getting a little too graphic, a little too dark, a little too nihilistic, a little too gross. And even though kids love them, and I still think they're harmless, you can't blame people who weren't used to this kind of material being shocked at the level of material that appeared in what they felt was a medium for children. They didn't appreciate the fact that EC and some of the other publishers were trying to grow comics up for an older audience. And since there was no rating system, there was no system for judging the comics levels of obscenity or what was socially unacceptable. This kind of material was frowned on because the average public didn't see any difference between The Vault of Horror and a Daffy Duck comic. So the industry was kind of scared by all this because they thought that the government would come and roll over them and crush them as they had the movie industry. A lot of people don't realize this, but in these same days of Frederick Wertham and the Senate hearings on comics, the government was trying to tax the movie business out of business. I mean, they took away the ability for the studios to own movie theaters because they said it was a monopoly. Under the antitrust laws, the studios could no longer own theaters. And then they put this whopping big entertainment tax on the new theater owners because you had local businessmen and private concerns buy up theaters and theater chains from the studios at bargain prices. And then they were practically taxed out of existence by the government swooping up most of their profits with this entertainment tax. So the comic book business was, already being heavily regulated by the government. The post office determined a lot of the material you saw in comics at the time, all the way up into the 60s, because subscription comics were sent through the mail under second-class postage, which was much cheaper, obviously, than sending them first class. There was no media mail. And comics wouldn't have been able to ship media mail anyway because they had advertising. So because they were a periodical, they could be sent second-class mail. But because of that, the post office determined that they couldn't be all comics, and they couldn't feature the same character throughout. Isn't that weird? That there had to be more than one story in the comic, and it couldn't feature the same characters as the lead feature. This is government overreach. This is government micromanaging at its worst. And so comics had to have those stupid 2-page text stories. And this is before they adopted the idea of a fan page or letters page. And that's why you see a lot of these, really badly written text stories in older comics. And they had to divide the issues between, Batman and Green Arrow. You couldn't buy a comic that was all Batman or all Superman or all Captain Marvel. And so the government was already leaning on the comic book industry. And they thought, well, geez, if they bring in censorship, if there's government censorship, if we have a comic book equivalent of the FCC, we're going to be in trouble. We're going to have a new boss. And the comic business didn't want that because comic business had at that time understood you have to be nimble, you have to be able to move fast. And if there's a government bureaucracy sitting on them, they wouldn't be able to move as fast as they did before to pick up on trends and do redundant publishing and basically determine their own future. Because if you're a business, regulation is your enemy. You don't want to be regulated. You want to be able to do what you want to do when you want to do it. So Dell Comics, they were one of the first to respond. Now, Dell Comics was literally half of the comics published were Dell Comics. There were dozens of comic book publishers, but Dell was the champion. They sold lots more comics than anybody else, and they had their own distribution system. In a lot of cases, their own rack, their own comic book rack. There were some store chains and independent stores that only carried Dell Comics. They didn't carry any other comic. And Dell Comics were not in the same vein as the other comic book companies. They didn't do lurid, exploitative material. They were always very careful to do family-friendly, G-rated stuff. And they basically started their own, wholesomeness guarantee. They took out full-page ads in their own comics, which generally didn't have ads. Dell Comics were so profitable They didn't have advertising in them. They were comics from beginning to end. The comic story might end on the back cover. That's how serious they were about it. And so you get this big 52-page magazine. It's comics from beginning to end. And it was generally complied with the post office because they were never a single story. So they were in good shape. And they might have a little text piece in the middle, some cutesy little piece of children's book writing, which was generally better written than the other comic book companies. So anyway, they took out full-page ads for many years, basically saying, hey, mom and dad, don't worry. We respect your kids, we respect you, and you're never going to see any of that filthy crap that you see at the other companies in our books. So Dell never subscribed to the Comics Code. They didn't have to. But the other comic book companies, mostly led by John Goldwater at Archie, decided to all basically create their own censorship. That they hired a board to review comic book material, and this was the Comics Code Authority, and they all agreed on what this code would be. And there were some obvious things. They didn't want to show drug abuse. They didn't want to show stabbings. Any kind of nudity, any kind of suggestion of nudity, because Frederick Wertham had the public convinced that comics were created by this army of perverts trying to corrupt your children. And that's true today. I don't think it was true then. But so they came up with these very, hard and fast rules. You couldn't depict kidnapping. You couldn't depict vampires, werewolves. This is very much the lockdown EC comics. The good guys always had to win. Respect for parents, respect for authority, all these things, to help the comics create good citizens, to be good role models. And the problem is it kind of made the comics a bit bland because, the comic book companies, so afraid of getting into trouble, adhered to the Comics Code Authority zealously. Never pushing the envelope, never challenging it. And they didn't seem to be able to figure out how to work within the confines, with rare exceptions. Now, the Comics Code became irrelevant over time. Marvel Comics published a few comics without the code on them. Famously, a Spider-Man comic that dealt with drug addiction because they felt it was an issue that needed to be dealt with. And so after a while, the Comics Code, it kept softening its rules and regulations, and then eventually just became irrelevant. And now we have the rating system, which I think is borrowed from manga, when they published manga here in the United States, because they didn't know what to do with manga, so they had to rate it, because some of the material was kind of iffy for American audiences. There's more adult content in it. So we now have a rating system that no one understands fully. And I don't think there's anybody really regulating it. I think the rating system is voluntary. The publishers look at it and go, yeah, this is, teen plus or whatever. I don't even know what the ratings are. But when I wrote Comics Code comics, I was fine with the Comics Code Authority. It didn't bother me at all because at least I knew the framework. And I wasn't, when I was writing superhero comics at least, I wasn't trying to get away with anything. I was writing, as I always say, I was writing for a precocious 10-year-old. I had no interest in presenting any material that would get him in trouble with his parents. So it was pretty simple for me. I liked working within the framework of the existing characters. I wasn't there to break them or change them. And I didn't mind working within the framework of the Comics Code because I was pretty much in agreement with the Comics Code. I felt I could write good stories without using 4-letter words. I know when the more mature comics came along and writers were like, oh, my writing will be so much better if I can drop F-bombs. Really? Is that what you need to make your writing better? Maybe paying more attention to believable character development might improve your work a little bit more. Logic, so, So yeah, I didn't never had a problem with the code. I was cool with it, and kind of sorry to see it go, because it was at least a base, a baseline for what could appear in comics. And after that, nobody knew what could appear. You just it's willy nilly and shifting situational morality, which is the world that we live in today. Neil Matthews. Knowing that you are a Punisher fan, have you read any other Frank Castle stories by other writers? And who, please, are your favorites? No, I never read another Punisher story. Sorry, I'm having fun with you, Neil. There's a few I remember that really impacted how I approached the Punisher. Back in the 80s, there were 2 Spider-Man annuals They were each written by Denny O'Neil and drawn by Frank Miller, and they were like the best Spider-Man stories I'd seen in a long time. Denny and Frank really had a vibe going here. And the first one, Spidey and Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom, I mean, come on, that's irresistible. For me, that was comic book heaven. But in the second one, it's Doc Ock and versus Spider-Man, the Punisher. And the Spider-Man is in conflict with the Punisher. They're both after the same goal, to stop Doc Ock's, crime spree. And of course, Punisher wants to do it lethally. Spider-Man does not. So it's a really cool story, but the most remarkable thing about it is its ending. Punisher is actually, Spider-Man thwarts Doc Ock and Punisher's arrested, and they're taking him away. And they said, something to him like, you're going to go to prison now, pal. And he says, prison? There's a lot of prisoners in prison. I'm probably quoting it wrong, but you get the point. The Punisher's nuts. I mean, he wants to go to prison because there'll be more prisoners there to kill. He won't have to do, a lot of searching. they'll be in the cell with him. They'll be in the prison yard. And I don't know if they ever wrote that story of the Punisher in prison. I would like to read that. Maybe Denny was going to get there. But it was very influential to me because I was like, ooh, that is so cool. That is such a cool idea. This guy's so driven. He doesn't mind being sent to jail because it's all about the prisoners. I mean, this is a total death wish situation. The other for me, of course, is, the writing of Mike Baron. Mike is what we call a seminal writer on this character. He didn't create it, but he took it to different places, and he took Punisher to dark places. Punisher becomes more of a loner. He's depicted as more of a sociopath. And one issue in particular, and I'm not an issues number kind of fan, so I don't remember what issue it was, but there was an issue in which Frank was up against a particularly challenging situation. And he goes to all of his subordinate cast. He had these people who supported him, people who had been in his same situation. They had lost a loved one to crime, and he had various skills that the Punisher could go to lean on them. And none of them can help him in this particular situation for whatever reason. They all have different reasons why. They simply can't do this. They're afraid. They don't have the skills. They don't have what he wants. And in each situation, he says, well, if you're, what good are you? I mean, if you can't help me, what good are you? And the climax of the story, not the violent climax, but the dramatic climax, is when he says this to Microchip. And as a reader, I'm like, whoa, what a prick this guy is. What a heartless bastard Frank Castle is. Microchip's been with him through thick and thin. Microchip's risked everything for him, including the life of his own son. And this is the way Frank Castle treats him. And I realize this guy is just, he's irredeemable as a character, which just made me love him more. I mean, he's like, I always say that Frank Castle embodies every negative male stereotype, and the idea of a guy who's just a user. I don't know. Mike's writing on this, on that one single story, just coalesced the character in my mind. Where it's like, yeah, okay, I thought I got this character before. I didn't. Mike showed me a whole different side of this guy that makes him all the more interesting. A lot of people think Punisher's a simple character. He's not. He's vastly complex. His actions are simple, but what drives him and his relationships with other people, extraordinarily complex and interesting. So yeah, those are the two biggies for me. Denny and Mike. And of course, there's been other great Punisher stuff. But that's what influenced my writing. There's stuff that came after me that I thought was good. Stuff that came after me I thought was horrible. But the two things that influenced me most were the work of Denny and Mike. Joshua Reed. Did you like writing Azbat, or was it just something that had to be done so you did it? Also, was Batman losing to Bane your idea, or was it something the higher-ups wanted to happen, and it was your job to craft the story? Yeah, I liked writing Jean-Paul Valley because he was an interesting character. He was flawed, and he was such a Denny O'Neil character. A guy who thinks he's doing the right thing, but he isn't. He's got a dark past. He's loaded up with religious guilt. And, he's been betrayed by the people he believes in most. And he's this damaged character. And the most interesting thing about Nightfall, as regards Jean-Paul Valley, is that Bruce couldn't see it. He only saw the surface. He only saw this guy's dedicated, fearless, tough. He didn't see what was driving him. And he thought he saw in him Bruce thought he saw in Jean-Paul Valley what he saw in himself. Someone driven by childhood trauma. Someone out to make things right. But, Azrael was driven by something more than that. So he's an interesting character to write. The artists, on the other hand, weren't so happy. I remember Graham Nolan in particular saying, I finally get to draw Batman, and it's not really Batman. And they changed it, and this friggin' stupid costume that kept evolving over time. And Graham was a bit frustrated because, we got to do some really cool stories with Joker and the rest of that, but it wasn't Bruce. So there was a bit of frustration on that end. But I dug it. I dug the character. I didn't like the character as a character. I don't like the Joker either, but they're fun to write about. But I don't like them as characters. I mean, not that they're poorly conceived, if you get what I mean. I just despise them because John Paul Valley he's just weak, morally weak. Now here's something I'll share with you. At the climax of all of this, where Bruce Wayne has to come back and take back the mantle of the Bat, he has to defeat Azbats and restore himself as Batman. That fell to Denny O'Neil to write. And he wanted to write the ending of Nightfall, and God bless him, it was his right. He came up with the whole stunt. He certainly had the right to assign himself the conclusion, which was really a coda at the end of the story. This epic 2-year-long continuing monster crossover, and then he gets to write the what was essentially an epilogue. And I remember he called me on a Saturday afternoon, which was really unusual. First of all, it was unusual for Denny to call me. He usually had a subordinate call me, and then he would get on the phone. And secondly, he called me on the weekend, which meant he was calling me from home. That never happened. And he called me, and he was in the middle of writing the final Azbats Batman confrontation in the Batcave. And he told me basically what he was thinking of. And then he said, what would you write? And I said, I would write the greatest fight that's ever appeared in comics. You've got an extra page length in this special, and I would take advantage of every page. It would be Hulk versus Thing. It would be Thor versus Ulick the Troll. Just a knockdown, drag out with the ending in question, the conclusion in question, and the Batcave is trashed by the end of it. That Azbats and Bruce would go at it with every gadget, weapon, and that available to them in the Batcave. And I said, what would make it really interesting is all the new additions that Azbats had made to the cave that Bruce wasn't aware of. So this is a dangerous situation. The Batcave is now a house of horrors. And, this is the edge that Azbats have. He could win this fight because there's all kinds of stuff in that cave that Bruce isn't expecting, doesn't know about. And I said, it would be a fight they would talk about forever in comics. And then he said, well, that's not what I want to write. And I said, well, Denny, you pretty much knew that I was going to tell you what I just told you. And he said, yeah, I know, but I don't want to write that. But I wanted to run back by you what I was writing and hear your thoughts, which I appreciated. I thought I was very honored by that. I mean, this guy recreated the Batman. This guy who saved the Batman, and he wanted to know what I thought, and even though he didn't want to follow it. So, boy, there was another part to your question. I'm going to go back to it because I forgot it. Oh, yeah, Batman losing to Bane was baked into Nightfall from the beginning. That was Denny. So we knew that was going to happen. So that wasn't anything I came up with. The higher ups, in this case Denny, came up with that one. Okay. W. Warwick. How would you go about finding and building trust with an editor for your writing? And where and when is it appropriate to clash a bit over edits, to begin a little back and forward polishing where necessary? Well, there's editors and there's editors. I always say there's three kinds of editors. There's the editor who trusts you. He knows your skill sets, and he hires you, and he lets you go, and he only picks you up when you fall, but otherwise you're on your own, because they hired you because they thought you were good. They thought you were right for the project. They don't micromanage. Then there's the editor who's, over your shoulder constantly, who wants to go over every line of dialogue. And generally, they're the least successful editors. Their projects are the least successful because they don't know what the hell they're doing. Most comic book editors, these days especially, but over the time of my career, I worked with editors who could do stuff. I worked with editors who could, write, draw, color, letter. They could do anything on a comic. Not all of them, but at least all the editors I had a skill set in comics themselves. They'd worked in it as a freelancer, so they understood. And then a new breed of editor who was they were just editors. Couldn't write their way out of a paper bag, but they would want to tell you what to do, kind of like film producers. And no idea what they wanted. They just knew what they didn't want. So it's impossible to work in a situation like that because you're writing while you're second guessing, yourself, and you can't do that because writing fiction is a mixture of ignorance and confidence, and if the confidence is taken away, all you're left with is ignorance, and you can't do the job. The third kind of editor was Don Daly, who I loved working with Don Daly, but he wasn't like any other editor, and I think I've explained that in other videos. If you want more on Don Daly, somebody will ask. But I always looked upon the editor-writer relationship as a partnership, not a boss-employee relationship. And I've always explained this to every editor I've ever worked with and every publisher I've ever worked with. That if I was invited to come on board their book or if I was invited to join the company, I say, look, understand that we're partners in creating quality material. And it's a give and take. And I don't mind guidance. I don't mind editorial guidance. I'll take it. As long as it's coming from the right place, if it's as long as it's an aid of making the end product better. I don't mind changing stuff. I'm very flexible, and a good editor is a necessity in a crazy process like creating comics. So you're either gonna fight or you're going to get along toward that goal. And my most successful collaborations with editors, and that's what it is, you're collaborating with the editor, are the ones where they saw it as a partnership too. That they actually appreciated me saying that. That I wasn't there to be an adversary. I wasn't going to bitch about editors. I don't like hearing freelancers bitch about editors because that guy hired you to do the job. How can you bitch? I mean, I had a guy go on and on and on to me about a top editor one time. And I said, this guy made your career. He hired you all the time. He put you on high profile projects with big royalty checks attached. How can you not like the guy? Maybe you don't personally like the guy, but, maybe he was right. Changes he had you make. So, that's a possibility. Now, the last time I really had an editor was Chris Duffy on the SpongeBob books. I loved working with Chris. I loved working with Chris when he was at DC, and then he left to go to Nickelodeon, and then he ended up on the SpongeBob comics. And when he got the job, he called me and said, I need content. So he said, can I call on you every once in a while? I need a 5-page story. I need a 3-page story. I need a 10-page story, to fill gaps. And I said, yeah. And he was surprised to find out how conversant I was with SpongeBob because I had kids at just the right age. And I'd actually been buying all of the Nickelodeon comics that he had edited because they're really good. They're really, if you find them on eBay, the Nickelodeon comics, particularly the SpongeBob ones, they're just brilliantly done. And the SpongeBob Monthly was much the same way. And I liked working with Chris. There's a lot of editors, but I'm just using Chris as an example of the kind of editor I like to work with. And he saw it as a partnership. And we would have these discussions. And a lot of times I would disagree with him, but I knew it was okay to disagree with him because we knew each other. And he knew I wasn't just being pissy and difficult. He knew, okay, I don't agree with you on this one. And, I even told him my rule about editors. It's like, when an editor asks for a bunch of changes, you give them 20% of what they want. And generally, they don't realize you didn't give them the other 80%. But so he and I would go round and round. I mean, we had these amazing conversations on just how stupid is Patrick. And it was Chris who guided me toward writing SpongeBob correctly. There's a difference between watching the cartoons and then writing them. I don't know how SpongeBob, more at the beginning of the process, I didn't know how SpongeBob would react to everything. And, Chris is the one that said, always lean into the fact that SpongeBob is an emotional basket case. And he said, look, he says, as practice, and this is amazing. Comic editors, I don't think, do this anymore. He said, as practice, I want you to write a story where SpongeBob gets frustrated over something. That something happens and either no one believes him or they think he did something wrong, and he and the reader know he didn't do anything wrong, or they know he's telling the truth, and he just gets more and more frustrated over the course of the story. And it was one of my favorite stories to write. It involved a celebrity who visits the Krusty Krab, and SpongeBob's the only one working. And no one will believe that this celebrity came in the story. Nobody will believe SpongeBob. And of course, we know as a reader, SpongeBob never lies. He's totally honest. He's a total naif. He's not a guy that would lie. And no one believes him. And he can't believe that no one believes him because he's telling the truth. And the gags grew because over the course of the story, he keeps running into this celebrity who really likes SpongeBob. And always, hey, Bob, how you doing? He's like a big time movie star, but there's never anyone around. And it was a fun story to write. And then, SpongeBob explodes at the end of the story. Explodes in this emotional, detonation that's marvelous to see. I think Jacob Shabbat drew that story. Incredible talent. But anyway, back to, editors and such. When you're working, especially when you're working on these like crossovers and things like that, a lot of moving parts, you need that editor, and he needs you, and you need to know that he has faith in you, and you need to live up to the faith he has in you. And if you can make that happen, it's magic. I mean, something like Nightfall, which we bring up a lot because it's the biggest thing I ever worked on. We would have these summits, and look at this room full of guys, and this was only part of the crew that got invited to the summit. And, we'd all play well together, play nice. And, you needed that to make this stuff happen. Now, today, I don't really work with editors. I work with guys like Richard Meyer and Vox Day. This is Vox and Sunday Go to Meeting Clothes. And they're not really editors, even though they edit. I refer to them as gatekeepers. And I call them gatekeepers when I talk to them. You're the gatekeeper. You're the boss. You're the one who's getting the money together, make this project happen. But still, it's a partnership. Very much a partnership. There's a lot of give and take. I don't always see eye to eye with either of these guys, but I know they'll listen to me. I know they'll let me make my case. And at the end of the day, a phrase I hate, I'm never going to say that again, but in the end, when all things are said and done, they usually let me have my way. But I don't argue over everything. Every once in a while, you got to give. You got to go, well, I'm not real crazy about that, but I'm going to let it go because it's not important. Then every once in a while, there's a hill you want to die on. The name of a character, the title of the book, things like that are going to be with you forever. It's like, oh, I don't want that crappy, crazy name. I had a long discussion with Vox about, he came up with this name for this character I hated, and by the end of talking to him, I fell in love with it. It's like, yeah, you know what? That's a great name. That works for all the reasons you say it works and more. I can think of even more things I can do just with that character's name. And with Richard, a lot of times he'll come to me with this insane idea. I mean, it's a wonderfully insane idea. I mean, it's a Jack Kirby level of crazy. He's got the mojo for stories. He'll come up with this wild high concept. And it's up to me to populate it with characters and create a plot that makes sense, a logical progression of events, and put surprises and exposition and setups and payoffs. And I do all of that. And a lot of times, well, he doesn't say this anymore because it's just understood. He'll say, this really isn't what I want, but I really like it. So, he's kind of like an editor and a muse. And I guess that's what gatekeepers are, because Vox is the same thing. Vox will call and challenge me with something. What if we did this? And then, of course, I'm thinking about that, and I, fire off a bunch of ideas, and there's a lot of back and forth. So these guys, even though they're not editors, they're publisher / gatekeepers. They get it. They understand the partnership thing, which is why they call on me so often, because I get it too. So that's all you need to know about editors. And also try to find editors, if you're going to apply, editors who edit things you like, because there'll be a rapport there, right? I mean, when Larry Hama was doing Conan, I knew I liked Larry Hama. I knew I liked him from his own work as a freelancer, but I knew I liked the stuff he edited. I read all the comics he edited, not because he edited them, but because they were the comics I liked. They just happened to all be edited by Larry, and there was my rapport. Same thing with Archie Goodwin. So there you go. That's almost everything you need to know about editors. JWL7. Hello, Mr. Dixon. I have 2 questions. I would like to ask you, firstly, when you began your classic run on Nightwing, why did you select Blockbuster as the top crime boss of Bloodhaven? Secondly, do you believe Blockbuster is Nightwing's greatest foe? Blockbuster was part of the deal. I didn't pick him. He was already chosen by the editors that they were going for a Kingpin vibe. They were very much going for a Daredevil vibe. And this kind of fit the template that they were looking for. I don't think I wrote a Daredevil type comic for them. But it's as simple as that. And Blockbuster was interesting enough for me. And he's big, mean, nasty, and scary. So I had no problem with it. But I didn't pick him. Tex Harmon. Do you still get ideas for DC or Marvel related characters? What was the last Marvel comic you wrote? Last one was Marvel Knights number 15. I think it came out in 2001. And that's the last Marvel thing that I worked on. As far as do I think of stories for characters, only the Punisher. Because I love writing the Punisher. Or I loved writing the Punisher. And you see things all the time. And when Katrina, the hurricane, hit New Orleans, boy, I wanted to write a Punisher story. I wanted Punisher and Katrina. Because he would be attracted to, first of all the crime that was going on high crimes and misdemeanors were happening all over the place in the cover and aftermath of that hurricane. And also he knew that, there would be lawlessness for the most part. The law wouldn't be paying any attention to a guy showing up and offing every criminal he could find. So, yeah. But I don't get to write the Punisher anymore. But I do write a series of books that scratch that same itch. They're the Levon Cade series. This isn't the commercial. There's more questions. Stay on. But I just want to mention it in passing because why not? It's my YouTube channel. I can push whatever I want, right? The Levon Cade series of novels. I've just completed the 10th novel. The 9th novel came out a little while ago. And Levon Cade is pretty much not my version of the Punisher, but in the same vigilante justice ilk. And like Frank Castle, he creates almost all of his own problems for himself and deals with them in a bloody fashion. So if you dug my Punisher work or you like this kind of material, this kind of Jack Reacher kind of stuff, check it out. It's a more grounded in reality version of the vigilante justice genre. And I really enjoy writing these. Andrew Schweitzer. Someone had told me that during this time, editorial had mandated that Batman was supposed to be an urban legend to the people of Gotham. Given his presence, to me, that'd be like telling me Clint Eastwood is just an urban legend and doesn't really exist. Can you clear this up for me? Yes. By our lights, Batman was an urban legend. Only a few people had seen him. He was like Bigfoot or a UFO or a Mothman, and only a few people had seen him, and he liked it that way. He wasn't, our version of Batman, he wasn't accepting the key to the city from the mayor of Gotham on the steps of City Hall in broad daylight. That wasn't our Batman. He's very much a dark figure, a mysterious figure, a figure that even some cops didn't believe in. And I did a story that never got published. And it had artwork by Brian Stelfreeze. And Brian drew a number of pages and did all the thumbnails, but an editor canned it before we ever got it completed. And it was going to be two issues of Detective Comics. And it was all about Batman as an urban legend. And in the story, a psychiatrist at Arkham is talking to, the Riddler and all these other inmates at Arkham. And they all tell the story about this Batman character. And she begins to realize this isn't a mass psychosis. Maybe this Batman really exists. And so she takes one of the orderlies from Arkham, this big, enormous, 300-pound guy, and they go into Gotham at night hunting for Batman. And they capture what they think is Batman and bring him back to Arkham. But they actually captured Man-Bat, which to this psychiatrist matches the description given to her by the Arkham inmates. This is Batman. And in the course of the story, Man-Bat escapes, and we find out that Man-Bat, just like a bat, could collapse his skeleton, and so he escapes through a vent and gets out into Arkham amongst the general population. And of course, they're terrified. It's Man-Bat, it's not Batman, and they're terrified. So there's like this crazy, violent situation going on at Arkham the police can't handle, and Commissioner Gordon calls Batman in. And so Batman and Man-Bat have to do battle in Arkham to protect the inmates, and all the inmates are cheering for Batman to win. And of course, the psychiatrist is like, "Holy crap! There really is a Batman, but I caught the wrong one." And it was a fun story to write. Unfortunately, it never saw the light of day. Maybe somebody at DC will wise up and bring Brian and I back in, and we can finish this. Because it was just a hell of a story. It's one of the, I wrote a lot of Batman, but it was one of my favorite of the ones I wrote. And it's hard to pick a favorite because I wrote so many stories, but it was fun to work on. Is what makes it a favorite. It's not like, it's great writing, it's genius, it's carved in stone. No, it was fun for me, which is, my number one priority beyond, keeping the artist and the editor and everybody else happy. But Yeah, I like the idea of Batman as an urban legend. I think it made it seem more real. Because if there was a Batman out there, he would be an urban legend. There's no film footage of him. He's not being interviewed on TV. Commissioner Gordon's doing everything he can to hide his existence because the police department's not going to admit, hey, this guy's solving all the crimes for us. So, yeah, I like that idea. Hey, if you have questions, suggestions, anything you want to send me, just generally communicate with me, send it all to brunobookstore@gmail.com. It's the most reliable way to get a hold of me. brunobookstore@gmail.com for those of you who are only listening to this. And hey, there's this site called ArcTunes. You might have heard about it, especially if you watch these videos. ArcTunes is a free, high-res, digital comics platform. You can read these things on any device all the way up to the big screen TV in your living room. That's how clear the resolution is. And there's dozens of different genres. We got lots of material, lots more coming. I'm working on 2 series that Marvel artist Joe Bennett's going to be drawing. We're starting to attract a lot of attention within the freelancer community, and we're over 2 million views. I don't know how many views there'll be by the time you see this. Maybe we'll be closer to 3 million views. But we're growing geometrically, and try it out. Like I said, it's free. I'm sure there's something here you're going to want to follow weekly as new episodes drop. So that's it for me. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button. Spread the word. Help me build an audience for this this little shindig. And I'll see you all down the road.